As is our custom, we are going to focus in on which one of these characters from the throne scene the Gospel of Luke is. So you'll remember that Mark was the lion with ADHD and Matthew was Denzel Washington / steely-eyed rabbi looking into your soul. With Luke, what we're left with is the beast, or the ox. So this patient beast of burden, caring for all, especially the outcast, right up to and including his sacrificial death. So what it's talking about there is over and over again in the Gospel of Luke, you see Jesus caring deeply for people and trying to take care of them and stuff. And let's see here. And even at the moment that he is about to be crucified, these women are crying out and he says, don't cry for me, cry for yourselves, so on and so forth. And so and then also it's only in the Gospel of Luke that you get the conversation with the criminal that's crucified next to Jesus, where Jesus says, today you'll be with me in paradise. So that's pretty wild. So the beast of burden, or the ox, and I felt like I came up with really good stuff for Mark and Matthew with the lion with ADHD and the steely-eyed rabbi, and I wanted to come up with something really good for Luke, but I really had a hard time, and so I went with a homeless mom, which might not work at all, but it just put the two things together, the concern for the outcast and the fact that Jesus is living in poverty throughout this gospel. And then moms who care for everyone and want to take care of everyone. It's probably not that great. But here we'll focus in on the ox. That is what the Gospel of Luke is like, the ox, caring for all. Here's your outline of the gospel. You get a prologue, which is nice, and then look, an infancy narrative. After that, you get pretty much the same structure as the Gospel of Mark, where you get a ministry in Galilee and then activity in Jerusalem and then a passion narrative. But you get this kind of extended bit right here. Up here, when Jesus is traveling to Jerusalem. And that's 10 chapters long. And that's by far the longest of any of the Gospels that we have, which records this travel from Galilee, which is up here, down to Jerusalem. Then we get the resurrection narrative and we get an ascension. So that's kind of cool. There's your outline. Okay, some things that are important to the Gospel of Luke. Number one, women. Women show up a lot in this gospel. They're just all over the place. They're like the role models of the Gospel of Luke. We also see the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is super active and is the agent that's doing a lot of work in this gospel. We also see prayer. Jesus prays before all of the important events throughout this gospel. And so we just see Jesus on his knees again and again and again, which is very cool. And then finally, the marginalized. This gospel highlights people that you might wish that, at least in the ancient world, folks would wish didn't exist at all and just didn't want to have anything to do with them. So those are all really important Luke things. So you can see these important Luke things even within just the infancy narrative. In the infancy narrative, number one, we have the focus on Mary. In Matthew, in the infancy narrative, the focus is really on Joseph, which is kind of funny. But in this infancy narrative, as you're reading through Luke, you'll notice that the angels interact with Mary. Mary does a lot of speaking. And so she is really the primary character in this infancy narrative. So already a focus on women. And then here's another woman that is present within the narrative, and that's Elizabeth. And so that's Mary's cousin, probably cousin. And when these two interact, you get, in a couple of different ways, you get the work of the Holy Spirit. Number one, when the angel tells Mary that she's pregnant, the angel says that the Holy Spirit will come upon her, and the power of the Most High will overshadow her. And so it's the Holy Spirit that's getting her pregnant, right? And then when these two meet one another, the Holy Spirit's at work again in that Elizabeth is pregnant with John the Baptist, and the Spirit stirs up John the Baptist to kind of wiggle a whole lot or something when she finally runs into Mary, and Mary's pregnant with Jesus. We also have kind of a juxtaposition of these two women who are filled with faith to Zechariah, who does not have any faith, and he in fact doesn't believe that he's going to be able to have a child, and so he is struck dumb. He's unable to speak for the entire pregnancy. Pretty wild, huh? Then we've got Jesus, little baby Jesus, who's born in a stable and placed into a manger, which is kind of lowly origins. And then we see here this focus on the marginalized or outcast, because the shepherds are the ones who come to visit baby Jesus. In this gospel, we don't have the magi or the wise men, however you want to say it, who are like rich dudes bringing presents. Instead, we have this focus on shepherds who come and honor Jesus and are some of the first to hear that Jesus has been born. And so shepherds during this time period were not necessarily like the upper echelons of society. And so that's kind of how we have a focus on the marginalized. All right, let's keep it going. Prayer. At each crucial moment in the narrative, we're going to see Jesus pray. He does it at his baptism, right before he chooses his disciples. He teaches the disciples to pray. There are 2 parables devoted to prayer, and then finally the prayer at Gethsemane, which you've probably heard a lot about. Then also concern for the poor. In the infancy narrative, we have this concern for the shepherds who are like kind of low on the totem pole of society. Then in the Beatitudes, whereas we've got Beatitudes in both Matthew and Luke. Now in Matthew, the Beatitude says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." But in Luke, it says just "Blessed are the poor." And so we don't know which one came first or if either one of them knew about the other one. But what we do see here is that Luke focuses in on the poor, and Matthew makes it a thing about being kind of downtrodden or something like that. We get this story of the rich man and Lazarus in chapter 16, in which a rich dude dies and goes to Hades, kind of like some version of hell. It doesn't say hell, it says Hades. And Lazarus also dies and goes to the bosom of Abraham. So I don't know what that means, bosom of Abraham. But that one's a really cool one, because we've got the poor guy going to the good place and the rich guy going to the bad place. So that's a good one. Parable of the Great Banquet has to do with the guy that invites a bunch of his friends to a banquet, and they're like, "No, we can't come." And so then he invites all of the poor and outcasts, and they all come to this banquet. So you're seeing this again and again. And then finally, we get this quotation from Isaiah when Jesus is starting his ministry in chapter 4. He reads this verse from Isaiah, which says that he's brought good news to the poor. So again, concern for the poor. All right, inclusion of the outcast. In the Gospel of Luke, we get the parable of the prodigal son and the parable of the Good Samaritan. And those don't occur in any other Gospels. Drill that into your brain. Prodigal son, Good Samaritan, only in the Gospel of Luke. And notice how both of them focus in on somebody that you think should be left out, right? The prodigal son, even his big brother, is like, this kid does not deserve anything, but it shows this embrace of bringing this son back in. And then the Good Samaritan also has this kind of flavor to it of nobody likes Samaritans. For the ancient Jewish people, they were ethnically different and they were religiously different. And so and there was always this infighting between the Jews and the Samaritans. Like, they would kill one of their people, or there'd be an act of terrorism and then retaliation and things like that. And so Jews didn't like Samaritans, and Jesus is preaching to Jews, and he uses the story of the Good Samaritan. It's kind of mind-boggling that he would hold out a Samaritan as the good guy, the outcast, the one that nobody likes. So that's kind of a big deal. All right, then prominent men versus lowly women, but the women always turn up like they're looking really faithful and stuff. So Mary, in the first chapter, Mary is full of faith and Zechariah doesn't believe. There's a sinner woman versus a Pharisee in chapter 7, the bleeding woman versus Jairus in chapter 8, a disabled woman versus a synagogue leader, a widow versus a legal expert, and then Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary the mother of James versus the disciples. So in each one of these cases, the women have faith, the prominent men do not. Even down here, the disciples hear from these women who have been to the empty tomb, and they're like, I don't think you're right. You're making that up. So they accuse them of kind of like gossip, which is amazing. Yeah, so those are good places where we see and Luke just does that. He just wants to focus in on the least of these every single time. And then finally, we've got this story of, I'm just kind of pulling this one aside, where is it? Oh, I didn't put it on there. I'm pulling this one aside, the teacher of the law versus Mary. And this is Mary as in Mary and Martha, the sisters. But we get this story in chapter 10 of a teacher of the law coming to Jesus and saying, what should I be doing? And Jesus says, well, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And then it says, wanting to justify himself, the teacher of the law said, well, who's my neighbor? Very good question. And that's when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And I'm going to have you do a little exercise with the story of the Good Samaritan, but put a pin in that. And then the very next scene, we see Mary sitting at Jesus' feet learning from him. So this guy who should have understood, a teacher of the law, kind of like me. A teacher of the law would be like a scholar, a biblical scholar. So somebody like me should totally understand and get who Jesus is, but he doesn't. And then Mary, who's just some lady, she gets it. It's pretty remarkable. Well, let's see here. If I can get it to keep going. I might not be able to. My poor computer's kind of overwhelmed with all of the stuff. So I'll leave it there. I think that there is at least one more slide, but oh, no, I think that's it. Those are all the slides. Look, I can't even click forward. So that's all the stuff that you need to know about the Gospel of Luke, and I hope that you enjoyed the whole homeless mom thing. All right,